The world is de facto at peace. It's America that's going around starting all the wars in the name of keeping the peace. They can negotiate with anybody they want. They can negotiate with Stalin. They can negotiate with Khrushchev. They can negotiate with Mao. If Nixon can go to China, then Donald Trump can go to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. Why not just get on a plane and go straight to Moscow, and then Tehran, and then Pyongyang, and then Beijing, and then come home and be Trump the Great? And have 4 years of peace and prosperity guaranteed, locked up from his first, he could do that in his first weeks in office.
Welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory Podcast, the show where we explore how to live free and prosper. You can find our show on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple, and every major audio platform. And today I'm delighted to be introducing you to our guest, Scott Horton. He's an anti-war activist, a libertarian political historian, an author, and the host of the Scott Horton Show. And as the director of the Libertarian Institute and editorial director of antiwar.com, Scott has dedicated his career to advancing and advocating for peace, liberty, and human rights. His most recent book, Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, is a bestseller on Amazon and challenges the accepted narrative about the war in Ukraine. Now, I've invited Scott onto the show, having spent the best part of the last 4 years fighting for the fundamental principle of freedom during the COVID chapter, as many as you well know. And increasingly, as I witness the escalation of war and conflict in the world, I feel similarly called to stand for the fundamental principle of peace. But it seems it's increasingly difficult to do so without getting caught up in some sort of politicized or polarizing narrative. So I wanted to speak with Scott today, not only as a humble student, as someone who regrettably has lesser understanding of the drivers of war. Unlike COVID, where I studied thousands of articles and spent thousands of hours trying to understand the situation, I come today as a humble student, really with a guiding force to want to understand, how do we move towards a world where we have greater peace? I've got a 3-year-old son who would love to grow up in a world where there is less violent conflict, and in fact, almost utopian ideal of moving towards a future where war is a figment of our imagination. Maybe I'm a dreamer, but as Scott has spent the best part of his adult life pursuing these questions, I thought there's no one better to ask how we can actually move towards such a vision. So I'm really excited to have this discussion. For those of you who are coming to this types of discussion for the first time and you've heard the mainstream narratives around war, you may be provoked or pleasantly surprised, depending on how you take today's conversation. So, Scott, I want to open by saying the idea of being an anti-war advocate in this part of the 21st century almost seems nostalgic. It feels like the ideology of the war machine has so deeply crept its way into every facet of our society, mainstream culture, and the political world that we're at a point now where I witnessed groups who previously stood against war are seemingly now even cheering on the war and supporting war, which completely baffles me. So my first question to you is, what do you think has happened to the large-scale peace movements that we saw so prolific looking back in the 60s and 70s? Why has this kind of large-scale peace movement eroded?
Well, if you want to go back to that time, I mean, it was the Democrats in power, and so it was people mostly to the left of them who were protesting, the new left of the late 60s and early 70s. They had already been sort of radicalized to the left of typical centrist liberalism by the civil rights movement preceding that. And then, of course, the Vietnam War was just a horror show. And, right around 60,000 Americans were conscripted and then killed in the thing for nothing. And everybody knew all along it was for nothing. So people were really radicalized by that. Now, it's kind of a confounding thing because, in a way, this sort of bastardized libertarianism that we call neoliberalism in America now, it really is the ideology of American empire. When people say that, like, I was raised by liberals who would say, like my teachers, for example, would say, well, the Great Society was Lyndon Johnson's wonderful experiment to make America great. But then Unfortunately, the Vietnam War ruined that legacy. But in fact, the Vietnam War was really an outgrowth of that same mentality, which is that nobody can ever achieve anything like freedom without the government to do it for them. Right? Like that was what Lyndon Johnson liberalism was about. Was so in other words, Vietnam was the great society too. We were making it, America was making South Vietnam safe for democracy or whatever, this kind of same thinking. So this is what got us into all the world wars and everything. But see, during the Cold War, it was a commie enemy. So that meant that right wingers were more likely to support the Cold War and to fight even the proxy wars against the left wing enemy at that time, where then left wingers were less in America were less incentivized to do so. So even though typically it would be a conservative value to stay home, husband your resources, and invest for a longer term future for your own society, and it's more of a liberal messianic Wilsonian remake the world at any cost kind of liberal ideology that really goes along with the policy. You also have on the right, of course, the whole just tough guy, macho warrior spirit that nobody can mess with us, and we like to fight and drink beers and drive trucks and whatever. So that means that never back down from anything. Certainly not if the liberals say that we ought to fight, then you don't want to be wimpier than them, do you? And the liberals, of course, are incentivized always to pretend to be tough because they're not. And so they're always afraid that they'll be called wimps and sissies and whatever and not want to fight, and hippies and whatever. And so then they always double and triple down. All their incentives, like think of Hillary Clinton, would say explicitly that as a woman and as a Democrat, I have to have a muscular foreign policy. I have to be a right-wing war hawk in order to essentially nullify any potential criticism from the right that I'm not man enough for the job to kill all the people that they need killed. And in fact, you see that same mentality carry over into their campaigning. Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, you just saw it right before your eyes, campaigned not to try to encourage leftists to show up and vote for them and progressives to show up and vote for them. They just assumed that by the scaremongering against the other side. And so then what they do? They tried to turn red states blue by being war hawks. And so Hillary Clinton, remember, went to Arizona and to Texas and brought Robert Kagan, the neocon war hawk, with her to say, see, this horrible hawk who's responsible for all of our recent catastrophes, he thinks I'm cool. So right-wing conservatives, you should come out and support me instead of that horrible isolationist Donald Trump. Well, that could never work. Certainly not for Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, but especially not Hillary. I mean, Kamala Harris at least had the advantage of being dropped from the sky and nobody really knew anything about her except on the surface what a clown she was. Whereas people had a depth of hatred for Hillary Clinton going back for generations. There's no way that Republicans are going to show up and vote for her. In D.C., maybe. Neoconservative hawks like Bob Kagan, sure. But out in the world, you got to be kidding. But that's what they think. And Kamala Harris did the same thing. She ran ads against Trump in Pennsylvania saying Trump wants to sell out Poland to the Russians. And we need a muscular Kamala Harris foreign policy to face down Putin. And people, right-wingers are never going to cross the aisle for a Democrat based on that. But the Democrats have it so ingrained in their head that the worst thing about them is that they're seen as being peaceful, and they have to overcome that handicap by being as horrible as they can be, right? So then on the right, you have people who are just, they're so accustomed to fighting. They're so accustomed to demonizing the enemy. The enemy is always the commies or the Muslims or whatever. It's always based on total ignorance. I mean, they had us fighting an Islamo-fascist caliphate, but that was the war that caused and created the Islamo-fascist caliphate. If you remember the history of the last, 15, 20 years over there, it was Bush and Obama who built the thing for them and then had to blow it back up again. Obama and Trump finally did the last time around. So they can be whipped into shape. And I bet you, everybody's shouting America first right now. If Donald Trump says we have to bomb the Ayatollah, then they'll click their heels. Many of them will say, okay, I guess we do have to bomb Iran or else Trump wouldn't be telling us so. And so partisanship just plays such a huge role in it. In fact, it's the greatest thing that Donald Trump ever did. Well, there's a few. I mean, he tried to negotiate with North Korea and he did a few other good things. But the best thing that he ever did was barbecue and fillet and destroy Jeb Bush in the primary election in 2015 and 16. Because what Donald Trump did is he got up there and he said, George W. Bush ruined everything. And that's that guy's brother, right? Because he had to hang all of the middle. And by the way, it was true that W. Bush had ruined everything. The Republican voters, the rank and file who had nominated and voted for John McCain and Mitt Romney, they were now being forced finally to accept the fact that they'd been suckers for W. Bush and that whole thing was a disaster and they shouldn't have done it. By this time, the caliphate had already risen and we're already at war with it again. So the whole Middle East policy was just absolutely a shambles, right? And so Donald Trump got up there and correctly said, and well, in Donald Trump hyperbole, he said, Bush's decision to go to the Middle East was not just Iraq, but just messing around over there, was the worst decision any president ever made. How do you like that, Jeb Bush? Right. So now Donald Trump's the alpha male on the thing, and Jeb is totally pantsed. He's a total dork and is gone. And everybody else on the stage, Rubio and the rest, they're nothing compared to Donald Trump. He has the nomination locked up at that point by using the Iraq War to destroy Jeb Bush. And then who else supported the Iraq War? Hillary Clinton, who he also defeated that same year. Right. So Donald Trump, Ron Paul did great. I love the man. He's the greatest living American, maybe the greatest American ever lived. Probably is. But Donald Trump did like 10 times more in terms of the social psychology of making it not even okay, but even mandatory for Make America Great Again, America First conservatives and populists to simply reject war. We can't afford it. We're tired of spending our sons and our nephews and cousins on this thing. And none of it worked out the way that they promised. Turns out they lied us into all of them over and over again. And so it's time to just make a break with this past of warmongering. And Donald Trump ran on that. Now, he also is very, very close with the Likud in Israel. And that is obviously the giantest of monkey wrenches in the works of his potential peaceful foreign policy. But he knows that that was what he ran on and won on. Was enough of this. We don't want this. Even though he bombed Yemen for 4 years and bombed Afghanistan for 4 years, he finished Iraq War III against ISIS, which you can't really even blame him for that, all other things being equal. But the Yemen and Afghan wars were really bad. He could have stopped those immediately, and he didn't. But almost as importantly as those horror shows, he ran, and his reputation since then, and in this election he ran on the platform of I didn't start any new wars, unlike every other president who gets us into a war. I didn't get us into any wars, he says, and that's what all his people say. That's his virtue. Now they could say he's the toughest SOB in the West and he beat them, Islam's good and all that. That could be the narrative, but it's not. The narrative is that he's too smart to be tough right now because we don't need tough right now. We need to stop and make some money and stop killing people because this isn't working out. That is what is smart. You could do 10,000 push-ups and be the MMA champion and be too smart to get into another stupid war, right? Tough and macho ain't got nothing to do with it. Patriotic ain't got nothing to do with it. This is between smart and stupid. This is between America First or what Hillary Clinton would have us do. And so instead we need to go with peace. So then, I'm sorry, there's a long answer. What happened in the anti-war movement? It moved to the right. And this is the time for, America Firsters and people who really want peace to support Donald Trump as loudly and as vigorously as they can when he does the right thing and let it known that, oh yeah, we stand behind you when you do stuff like that. And then, but when he does the wrong thing, you got to hold him to that correct standard. Maybe Israel wants you to bomb Iran, but we don't. And Israel ain't America. America's America. And we're tired of this stuff. And quite frankly, Persia's too big. And once you start bombing it, you're going to have a real problem on your hands. And so he's got to know that no matter what people, however they on the right, however loyal they are to him as their leader, that they will not accept any more of this George Bush, John McCain foreign policy at all. He clearly wants to end the war in Ukraine. He needs to be loudly cheered for that. Any step that he can take to negotiate a peaceful agreement, well, other than doing the stupid thing and trying to promise some kind of war guarantee to Ukraine or something, or bring them into NATO. But any reasonable step he can take to end that war should be supported. And then same thing with North Korea. And quite frankly, like the narrative should be, who's afraid of the Ayatollah? Donald Trump is the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln. Surely he can go over there and shake hands with the Ayatollah and make a deal with the Ayatollah. Tell you what, you sell us some oil and we'll stop, we'll lift some sanctions. You stop funding Hamas and Hezbollah, whatever, make a deal. They can make a deal. And by the way, Donald Trump was asked about this. And I guess Miriam Adelson wasn't standing there when he answered. He goes, yeah, I can make a deal with the Ayatollah as long as he doesn't get nuclear weapons. Well, look, the Ayatollah doesn't want nukes anyway. The Ayatollah has got, a latent nuclear deterrent. He has the ability to make nuclear weapons, but he's never tried to make them because he knows that if he starts trying, that's the excuse for the war. So just don't attack me first and I won't make them, and then you won't attack me for making them, and we'll just not have a war together. That's the way the status quo has been for 20 years. We could just leave it like that if Donald Trump is willing to just go over there. And why not? Why not just get on a plane and go straight to Moscow and then Tehran and then Pyongyang and then Beijing and then come home and be Trump the Great and have 4 years of peace and prosperity guaranteed, locked up from his first. He could do that in his first weeks in office. He could do that. And who would tell him no? He says, air traffic control, Tehran, give us a runway. We're coming. What are they going to do? Shoot him down? Hell no. They might make him wait half an hour, and then he'll have an audience with the supreme leader, and they can come to terms. Simple as that. If Nixon can go to China, then Donald Trump can go to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. Why in the hell not? And they already did their stupid Russiagate thing. They already shot those blanks. That cartridge is empty, man. They got no claim on treason on his part. He wants to go make peace with America's enemies. Everyone knows it's because he's putting American interests first, not theirs. He's doing what's right for this country. If he can do that. But he will absolutely need the chorus on the right to shout down the war party and say, no, enough of your fake macho W. Bush crap. We want peace now.
I mean, this, for a start, I think you've helped me understand my own naivety a bit deeper on this, on the history. I think you and I have just met. I would consider myself to be a lifelong politically homeless individual. I would consider all my political choices to be poor in the past. I voted for the Reds, the Blues, the Yellows, and the Greens in my adult life in the United Kingdom. Never paid off, but I am someone who is pro-liberty. Some would describe me as libertarian on that basis, but I tend to try and shirk labels, but that would be probably the most closely aligned. Someone described me as post-ideological the other day. I don't know what that means, just returning to rationality, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting. As someone in my university years at the time that, the Iraq war was playing out, there was protests on the street when I was a student, and people would kind of hark back to that kind of 60s counterculture that you touched upon. And I think it has, people are speculating that conservatism has become the new counterculture, and some are describing that as an inversion because, it does sometimes feel like we're living in the upside down, but you've given me a different perspective on that it seems that these polarities have always played out. And it just seems that, whatever the dominant narrative or ideology is at the time is where the political parties line and therefore their supporters follow. But I do wonder your point around this Bush type macho war, we must have war type ideology. Some people in my network would argue that this neocon idea is that, peace through strength is a requirement. We must show our muscle. We must, be strike. I've been watching Cobra Kai recently, you know, strike first, strike hard, show no mercy. It does almost seem to be a part of the American way to a British observer from the kind of Bush type mentality that you've alluded to. Do you think that can now dissipate under the weight of the strength of Trump's leadership? Do you think there is appetite amongst the American people to let go of that ideology? Do you even think it, you know, what's your take on the idea of strength through peace? You know, is that a rational way to think?
Yeah. Well, okay. So first of all, I should say, as a libertarian, I'm just extremely as anti-government as could be. I agree with Ron Paul. He said we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines, and which, by the way, like quite honestly, one American nuclear sub could destroy all of Russia. You could fit more than 200 warheads on one American nuclear sub.
A quick break for a word from one of our partners. In times of economic uncertainty, gold has always been used as a safe haven for wealth. It's a tangible asset that has historically held its value, even when markets were volatile. And now more than ever, it's crucial to have physical assets that can protect your wealth. That's why we've partnered with the Pure Gold Company. They offer a secure, reliable way to buy physical gold bullion and precious metals, whether you're looking to diversify your portfolio, hedge against inflation, or simply protect your savings. With fully insured gold products stored in world-class private vaults, you can rest assured that your physical gold is safe and secure. For bullion-grade gold bars and coins, the Pure Gold Company makes it easy to purchase physical gold that you can actually hold. If you're ready to take action and safeguard your wealth, then visit danastingregory.com/gold to download your free guide and take advantage of a free consultation to explore your gold bullion options.
So quite literally, we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines, and to the nth degree, we could obliterate our enemies off the face of the earth, literally, with a couple of good submarines. Now, I don't usually argue from my pure libertarian plumb line point of view. I try to argue all other things being equal, everyone else's understanding of the nation states of the world and the way they are now. And essentially, you know, the justification for the world empire before was facing down the Soviet Union, which was ruled by the absolute lunatic Joe Stalin, and then his henchman Khrushchev, right? And then on their southern and eastern flank there, Mao Zedong, you know, who was like Pol Pot, only with an entire empire to rule instead of a crappy little country, but was just as absolutely insane in the way that he applied his Marxist dogma and his communist authority over the people of that country. As people argue whether it was, you know, 20 to 30 to 40 million people who were starved to death as they tried to implement a Marxist economy in that massive nation is just insane. And so because what the hell, I was just a teenager at the time or less. So what do I know? It was the Cold War and the Reagan years when I was a boy. So if you say to me, we had to face down the commie empire, then I would say, all right, whatever. But the commies are gone. And there's no Hitler anywhere in Europe. And spin the globe, right? There's no power in Latin America at all. The biggest power in Latin America is Brazil. They're no military challenge to us ever, nor could they be in 10,000 years. You look at Africa, the closest thing to a power in Africa is America's satrapy in Egypt. There's no other nation state in Africa that has the ability to project force anywhere. And who could Egypt even attack? You know, Sudan maybe, or Libya, not Israel. And they're of course under America's thumb anyway. Every nation state in Europe is our friend or treaty ally. And current concepts notwithstanding, the Russians are at least our partners. They're not our enemies, and they're not even truly our adversaries, except for well, they play their own role, but it's clearly the Americans have taken a leading role in precipitating the crisis with them. And even Red China, they still have that red flag, but America ended our Cold War with China in 1974, 50 years ago, 60, wait, yeah. So this is, 50 years ago. This is Richard Nixon, 17 years before the Soviet Union fell down. America had already ended our Cold War with China. So you could consider them commercial competitors. There's no need for them to be our military adversaries at all. They built up a naval force enough to keep us away, but they're not trying to conquer the world. And even if they're the dominant power in Asia, that doesn't mean that they're going to invade Japan. You know, if they take Taiwan back by force, that would be a tragedy, but it wouldn't truly be a challenge to American national interests or the national interests of any other major nation state in the world. It's not the same as if they were to, try to outright reinvade and colonize Korea or attack and colonize Japan, which nobody thinks that. That's completely crazy. In 2,000 years, they haven't been able to take over Vietnam. They're not, you know what I mean? China's already an overextended empire. They're not going anywhere. They're not a threat to Muslim Central Asia. They're not a threat to Russian Siberia. They'd be crazy to get in a fight with the Russians. If they were going to do anything crazy, it would be seize Siberia. But then they're in a nuclear war. So it couldn't possibly be worth it to seize a bunch of gold and timber and fresh water from Siberia when you could simply buy it and trade it and all that. They have a commercial relationship that worth bazillions. It would be insane to try to break through violent conflict. So, and then that's it. Who do we got left? India? And they're finally pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. They've abandoned communism. They never were part of the Soviet Union or any of that in the Cold War, but they had an extremely commie economy, if not a totalitarian dictatorship, an extremely, government-owned economy that was just completely dysfunctional. And they're finally getting over that, beginning to have better and better property rights and more wealth. But does anyone think that India poses a threat to even, I don't know, Arab lands or something like that in the next 100 years, in the next 200 years? And then that's it. Keep spinning the globe. You're out of world powers. You're out of anyone with even the conceptual capacity to threaten anybody else. So I'm sorry, but the world is de facto at peace. It's America that's going around starting all the wars in the name of keeping the peace, in the name of holding the whole world down. Oh no, the whole thing would unravel. I guess India and Iran would go to war against each other tomorrow if America wasn't there to warn them that they better not. But I just don't believe that. I think there's no reason to really believe that that's true. And then when they say, well, if it wasn't us, it would be the Russians or it would be the Chinese or it would be somebody else. No, it wouldn't, because they can't afford it any more than we can afford it. If anybody could afford it, it would be us. But check the national debt. It's $36 trillion. And now interest on the debt is the single biggest part of the national budget, bigger than even the empire itself. So game over. That's it. How in the world would Beijing look at W. Bush and Barack Obama and go, oh, yeah, we're going to blow our brains out and be just like that? That's what we're going to do. We're going to kill everything we built. We're going to spend it all trying to conquer Arabia, trying to conquer Mesopotamia, trying to pacify the Pashtuns in Paktika. Why in the world would they be so stupid to do that? There is no reason that they would, or reason to fear that they might.
Is it then is it purely fear of this escalation that perpetuates this war? Because I'm curious, is America's dominance or perceived dominance and need to kind of retain that hegemonic state part of the problem? Is it a facade? Do they need to be perceived by others as the most powerful force in the globe in order to avoid unraveling the worst case scenario of these wars escalating? Is it just a perception? What's really driving it? And I suppose where I'm taking this is I want to understand, how does that lead to an unraveling under the Trump administration potentially?
Well, yes, I think essentially the way you're framing it is right, that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They go, well, look, we can't let Iraq dominate the Middle East, but Iraq wasn't dominating the Middle East. Hell, America told them they could invade Kuwait. It's just they weren't supposed to take the whole country. They were just supposed to take the northern oil fields as punishment for Kuwait overproducing from shared oil wells. The State Department told them, go ahead. So he wasn't, going to then, invade Saudi Arabia and then Iran next? Well, America asked him to invade Iran for us just 10 years before that, and he failed at his attempt at regime change. So there's no reason in the world. Was he going to, now he's going to kill the king of Jordan and take over Jordan and then march on Israel? Give me a break. Saddam was never Hitler unless you lived in his nation. and you had said something negative against him, then yeah, he was Stalin to you or Hitler to you. But he was an offensive threat to dominate the entire American or the entire Middle East. And that was why America had to make sure that we were the dominant force there. Instead, poppycock, pure hogwash, nonsense, lies, dastardly lies, impossible, ridiculous lies. Same kind of thing going on with the expansion of American power in Eastern Europe. It's on the record. I just published a book with something like 8,000 footnotes, 7,900 citations in it. And we, I show where all along they knew that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if we insist on being the dominant power in Eastern Europe, that's going to be great for all the countries in Eastern Europe who want American protection. But it's going to end up causing the conflict with Russia that you claim to need the defensive alliance to protect everyone else from. So they're making it happen. And then they say, well, if we do have a problem with Russia, there's always NATO, and they wouldn't dare mess with us then. So they know it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then they fulfill it. And they keep going and they keep going until it blows up and it becomes exactly what they knew it would. And then they react exactly as we know they will. They say Putin's pure evil, and he did this because he woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning and decided to recreate the Russian Empire. Couldn't possibly have been anything that we did, you understand. No. This was an unprovoked attack. And somebody did a great, I think it was Orf, 0RF on Twitter. I'm almost certain it was him that did a montage of them saying unprovoked attack, unprovoked attack, unprovoked, unprovoked, unprovoked. And it reminded me of I could see like a Saturday Night Live skit where like somebody has a coin and they're like trying to hypnotize you and make you repeat, like trying to force you, somehow coerce you, manipulate you into something. Now you call it that. Now you say unprovoked attack. Now you believe it is one and you instruct other people how unprovoked it was. You must internalize that it was an unprovoked attack. They said it 100,000 times. And yet, obviously, that's just a cheap alibi for the fact that they provoked it. Obviously, they did. And you can tell just like on the face of the argument, just look at it. America is the superpower. The Soviet Union no longer is. It doesn't exist. There used to be two superpowers. Now there's only one. We're number one, USA. We, the middle part of North America, our political government and military force is the dominant power in Europe, including in Eastern Europe. And that was always the contest. The Russians said 1,000,000 times over, why do you keep expanding, man? It's almost like you're threatening us. Geez, you're coming right up to our borders. I really wish you wouldn't. And Putin, of course, they say he's such a lunatic and a Hitlerite and whatever. The guy's a bureaucrat. He's essentially, you could say he's a psycho, but like, I don't know the exact psychological definitions, but like, which is the one that doesn't have emotions at all, right? Like Dexter on that show where like, he just doesn't ever get upset. He gets like technically angry, where he's like, well, clearly like this is a problem and we have to do something about it. But it's always deadpan. And he'll even say like, we are, very cross with our American partners and we'll have to figure out how to resolve this issue. In fact, you know what? Here's an anecdote that just blows me away. And this is well reported in a few different places. It's during the worst of the Syria war 10 years ago. And Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was, by the way, the ambassador to the United States during September 11th, when his government had a lot to do with helping those hijackers pull that off. Same guy 10 years ago was helping, he's emptying Saudi prisons of jihadi kooks and shipping them all off to Syria to become suicide bombers in the jihad against Bashar al-Assad under Barack Obama back then. And he had this meeting. You might remember the whole Maidan revolution took place while the Russians were hosting the Winter Olympics in Sochi, right? And Putin had spent billions of dollars on these Olympics. And Prince Bandar bin Sultan went there and he said to Putin, reportedly, listen, I can protect the Olympics from any terrorist attacks, if you just back off in Syria a little bit. And instead of reaching out and cutting the guy's throat, Putin reportedly said to him, well, this is contrary to the spirit of international cooperation against terrorism. And I would hope that our governments could work more closely in the future against common threats from the jihadi bad guys. Thank you very much. Like, you might have thought that he would have just murdered Prince Bandar bin Sultan right there on the spot with his bare hands. What did you just say to me? You just threatened my Olympics to my face? The president of the Russian Federation? Like, why wouldn't Putin go ahead and throw him out a window at that point? Instead, he says, well, listen, I'll have my diplomats talk to your diplomats so that we can arrange better future cooperation because, you know, the last thing we want is trouble, whatever, right? Like, so in other words, he's a SOB, but he doesn't have emotions. He's all business, right? Doesn't mean he's not mean. Doesn't mean he's not willing to murder people, to start a war or to escalate one by 10,000%. Doesn't mean that he's not a cruel, hard-nosed autocrat, if not exactly a dictator. But he's a cold, calculating statesman from his own point of view, rather than as they portray him, this, you know, essentially this psychopath. I mean, look, I don't know if this is the definitive work on Hitler or what, but I read like 2/3 of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And at least according to that thing, Hitler was like the most fanatical lunatic who ever woke up at 4 a.m. to get to work in the history of mankind. Like, this guy was the most single-minded, determined future dictator of Germany. For years, he was absolutely relentless, would stop at nothing but to achieve that power so he could have his revenge and all that. Man, you can't say that kind of crap about Vladimir Putin. Give me a break. He wasn't, people say, oh, he was KGB. He was a clerk at the KGB. He wasn't a spy. He was a desk jockey. And that, look, he had power. But I'm just saying, he wasn't out there slitting throats personally. You know what I mean? And this is, I don't know what people hear when they hear me say this. I'm not defending the man or anything he did other than from against ridiculous caricatures, because this is what W. Bush and Dick Cheney did with their fake axis of evil crap 20 years ago, is they said, listen, you don't talk to evil. If you talk to evil, then you're dignifying it. In other words, our Secretary of State at the time, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4-star General Colin Powell, he's not man enough to go and talk to and face down Iraqi diplomats. For Powell to even walk in the room with them is like him personally placing a halo over their head and petitioning to get them into heaven and guaranteeing their legitimacy as the rulers of Iraq before all of mankind. But come on, that's just an alibi for not negotiating with them. Don't you see? Dignifying evil. They're just jerking your chain, man. They can negotiate with anybody they want. They can negotiate with Stalin. They can negotiate with Khrushchev. They can negotiate with Mao. Then they can negotiate with anyone unless they don't want to. Simple as that. For them to invoke, justifying evil or whatever, is just PR for the rubes. Clearly, it's a shallow excuse for them to not do what it takes to keep the peace because they have other agendas. They'd prefer war. You know, it's the same kind of thing where they talk about in Israel, where you're just supposed to presume that the poor little Israelis just want peace, but the terrorists won't leave them alone. When in fact, the Israelis don't want peace at all. They want war until all those Palestinians are dead or off the land that they want to steal. They want to go drown in the Jordan River or bake in the sun in the Sinai or something, fine. But the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Israelis will fight for 500 years. They'll kill Palestinians from now on until they get that land peace. They don't want peace. Who said they wanted peace? A liar? Look with your eyeballs what they do. They do nothing but murder people and steal land every single day. That's what they want to do. Stop presuming they want peace. Stop presuming they're trying to seek what you would think would be a fair and equitable and reasonable solution, and look at their motives and, you know, the objects they actually pursue.
Scott, I mean, this is fascinating. I openly stated my naivety at the beginning, and I feel like I'm getting an education. The problem with that is that I can't debate. You know, I'm resonating with what you're saying, but I can't debate you. But you've got the receipts. I mean, how many footnotes did you say in your book?
That's okay. I got 8,000 citations in the book. And look, I wrote 2 books before this. I wrote my first book is about the war in Afghanistan. It has about 1,300 citations in it, which I thought was a lot then. Um, my next book actually doesn't have any footnotes at all because I was in such a hurry and I really wanted to sell it to everybody's Uncle Bob. I wanted to try to get it out as more of a popular thing. That's called Enough Already, about the Middle East wars. Although there are, you know, it's almost complete with citations in the prose itself. So if I don't say it was Foreign Policy Magazine in March of '09 that reported this, although I usually would say something like that right in the text, I still might say, this bureaucrat said to this bureaucrat on this day, exact quote. So you should be able to find it. I don't make a bunch of general assertions. You know, I try to make them specific enough that you should be able to double check anything that I claim in there, even though I don't have all the footnotes in the second book. But then in the third one, I go completely overboard and I have 6,300 footnotes and 7,900 citations. And I think I may do a footnote version of Enough Already one day if I can ever find the time to do it. But yeah, I don't need to embellish this stuff because the truth is really bad.
The different type of war in a while about the war on truth. But before we get there, there's a few things on my mind that I want to discuss. So firstly, in the context of all of these wars, as someone who is, I've already self-confessed, politically homeless, within the current environment, people, yes, they're indoctrinated, and it was just the same during COVID. Safe and effective. Safe. It's how you build a belief system. You say the same thing over and over with intensity. It repetition creates that belief in people. So the media know what they're doing. But what it's leading to in this polarized, tribalized society, where everything is fragmented, you have to pick a side on every topic. And I was just talking to Charles Eisenstein about this, and he left a question for you, by the way, which we'll come to at the end. But we were joking about like everything is now a badge. You've either got this badge on or that badge on. You know, we used to live in a time where there was like thousands of badges. I even walked past the shop recently that had badges for sale, and it was the first time I seen a badge shop in like a decade, and there was thousands of badges. But now you've got one or two. It's like you're either on that side or that side. And what I find frustrating is that I'm supposed to pick a side in any war. And there's always a right and wrong in the mainstream view. So like you have to be pro-Ukraine. You have to be pro-Israel in the current environment. Well, I'm not in favor of any form of war. I'm not in favor of any war. I'm also not in favor of any tyrant. I don't care if you think one tyrant is better than the other. It's tyrant A versus tyrant B. In every situation, you know, that neither is helping themselves. I don't want to support either of those. I don't want to put a flag of any of these countries on my profile. It's certainly not in the way that it's intended to support one side or the other. I support humanity. I support people. I don't want people to die needlessly because of the war machine and the power that they have to instigate, you know, mass conflict where innocent civilians lose their lives. I mean, I literally get to there are occasions when I've been here and I try and stray away from the news as much as possible because it just is depressing. But anytime I hear the story of the ongoing conflict and war, and I look at my son, I think, thank goodness I live in a country that is not directly affected by war. I'd hate to wake up and see that my neighbor has perished at the hands of this conflict. How do we escape that, Scott? I mean, how do we get to a point where it's just like, I don't care what you say. I don't care what you say. I just stand for peace. And I don't want to play the political game. Is that even possible? I mean, this comes to the genesis of my original question, because in my mind, what I'm really asking is how do we get people to see beyond the political polarization and to lay down their allegiances to the party and actually get to a point where we say, screw it. We're not benefiting from this. Who's benefiting from these wars? And how do we finally reject and say no? How do we actually say no to any of these conflicts? How do we get to that point?
Well, you know, it's sort of, I guess this goes back to what you were saying about, you know, the liberal and the conservatives flipping as to who's the dominant culture and who are, you know, the punk rockers. It's kind of weird to have right-wing punk rock, but there's such a thing, I guess. And so
punk rock has disappeared. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of, you know, and there was a time, I guess, recently where like, you know, the left was, I guess, it depends where you are, but I guess you would argue, most would, I guess, argue that America was essentially a Reaganite center-right country until W. Bush finally really blew it for the right. He put everything into Iraq and torturing people to death and just spent all of the conservatives' political capital. So then when Obama came, that was when the left really became dominant in the political culture. And this really helped. I skipped this part of my earlier answer. This really helped to neuter the anti-war movement on the left, because he was perceived as being one click to the left of Hillary Clinton, and he's tall, dark, and handsome and whatever. And so all the progressives who had been the anti-Iraq war movement now decided that that stuff wasn't that important. He tripled the Afghan war, and they didn't say anything because he was the one who was doing it. So that really helped to, to moot and mute the anti-war movement on the left during that time. But anyway, point being that the left stayed dominant through Donald Trump's first term because of the Russiagate hoax and all that. They essentially denied him and the right their victory in the election. So the pendulum was not really allowed to swing to the right then. And then they, through their laptop hoax and other means, secured the election of the Democrat last time. But then they got trounced. So now the left is not the dominant political culture.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think like the COVID chapter, which was largely dominated in the US by the Democrat Party, it's got the lost left now. I know so many people who historically aligned with the left who are now like leaning.
Right. And we'll never go back. I mean, even I've seen people talking about just the pardons, where Biden has picked just the absolute worst scum of the earth to pardon. The judges that sold children to a private prison company, for direct payoffs. He let them out. A woman who cheated people out of their chemotherapy by watering it down and using expired old chemo meds on people. A woman who was responsible for the greatest heist of a mayor or a city council woman or whatever she was of public funds from a local city in all of American history. Like these just, and his own, scumbag, drug addict, corrupt son.
It's time for a quick word from one of our partners. If you believe in the freedom to communicate, the right to privacy, and freedom from corporate surveillance, then you need to check out Proton. Many of you would have heard of Proton Mail. Proton is born out of the desire to create an internet that puts people before profits. Proton helps you to maintain control over your digital life, whether it's sending messages encrypted through Proton Mail or browsing privately with Proton VPN or securely storing your important documents with Proton Drive. Proton is the ultimate tool for safeguarding your digital freedom. Don't let your data be sold or your privacy be compromised. Go to danastingregory.com/Proton and start using Proton to protect your digital life today.
It's such insult to injury. It's not a deep political intrigue. It's just, did you hear he pardoned the judge that took money to lock 10-year-olds in prison? Yeah, he pardoned that guy. And so even anybody's non-political friend or auntie or anyone could just understand the absolute outrage of that. I saw a tweet where a guy said, He teaches about political corruption in the third world. He went to Pakistan and he asked them, have they ever heard of anything so corrupt as a judge taking money to lock up 10-year-old children in juvie? And they couldn't believe it. Well, that's how it works in Pennsylvania. And that's Joe Biden's friends that he just let out of jail. Instead of, them being hanged from trees, they get time served and home detention and all this in the name of COVID. The judge gets to serve his prison sentence at his house with his wife. And now he's free to go entirely. So people they feel how much they're hated by the Democrats, and they're starting finally to really hate them back. So then, this is where I think we're getting to the point then where, okay, fine. So the left, they cancel culture themselves out of business. They're just done. We are all so sick of them. And so now the fight is on the right. Are we going to let a bunch of, George W. Bushian war hawks dominate, which they already do dominate inside the Trump administration? No question, with his cabinet picks, it is not looking good. But then again, the real core, and maybe the solid majority of the Trumpian right in America are no longer war hawks, and they really don't want to hear it. Now, as I said, if he says, come on, boys, we're going to Iran, then many of them will line up, but many others will feel very betrayed and understand that this is for Israel, not for America, and it's just not right. And so it's just a matter of the common political understanding shifting. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this over there in England, but you're in England, right? Or Scotland, or in England. So over here, there's I'm sure you're familiar with Candace Owens, the black conservative, a media personality influencer. I was on her show a week ago. She's very nice. Um, she has an incredible amount of pull, and the Zionists made a huge mistake by kicking her out of the sort of mainstream Trumpian right and trying to demonize her and call her an evil, vicious anti-Semite and sister soldier and you're a bad guy and we don't like you no more. But it didn't work. They just made her more powerful. And she is absolutely fearless. I'm telling you, I just was spending a little time with her last week. She don't give a dang about whatever they can dish out, she can take. And so then it's redounded against them terribly, because now she's like, oh, guess what? Now I'm going to interview Phil Turney, who survived Israel's attack on the USS Liberty. And I'm going to tell 3 or 4 or 6 million people about that. And her show is huge. She's got 3 million subscribers, but that USS Liberty interview's been seen by 5 million something people already at last count. It's huge. So this is a matter of just the dam breaking. And the day before she aired that, she interviewed me. And the interview was all about how the neoconservatives are essentially Israel's fifth column in the United States, and they're the ones who lied us into war with Iraq. They're the ones who insisted that America support al-Qaeda in Syria 10 years ago and again right now. And they're a giant security risk, and they're loyal to a foreign power, and screw them. And we talked about that for a couple of hours, and then the next day she played this thing about the USS Liberty, and it's, the wool is being pulled from people's eyes. And it's and I know people get very defensive, so I'll just go ahead and be defensive myself and say this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. If we were talking about any other state, if we were talking about perfidious Albion and England's, undue influence in the United States of America, we could absolutely have that conversation, especially historically. We'd be absolutely opposed to that. And it wouldn't be because of what Anglo-Saxons you all are. It would be because your interests are not the same as ours. And getting us to subsidize your national security policy may or may not be, and probably would not be, in America's national interest. It's the same thing here with Israel. On the basic level, anyone who knows really the first or second thing about it should be able to see Israel's enemies are the Shiites. Iran, now Baghdad, because America did what Netanyahu wanted and did the last Iraq war, 2 Iraq wars ago, Iraq War II. The Shiites in Syria and Hezbollah. Well, now America's overthrown, ensconced the Shiites in power in Baghdad, but now overthrown the Shiites and their allies in Damascus and turned Syria over to a bunch of al-Qaeda kooks in order to what? To serve Israel's interests, because Israel needed to break that connection between Hezbollah and Iran. But by supporting bin Ladenites, they're the ones who knocked our towers down. They're the ones who used to work for American Britain, and I guess still do again now, but in the meantime have slaughtered thousands of Americans. They were also the worst part of the the vanguard of the Sunni-based insurgency that killed 4,000 Americans in Iraq War II. Another 500 died fighting the Shiites, but in an unprovoked attack, to coin a phrase, against Sadr. But the vast majority of the Americans who were killed in Iraq War II were killed fighting the Sunni-based insurgency, the worst part of which, the vanguard of which, was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And they got America siding with the bin Ladenites against the Shiites, when America's interest should be, of course, keeping the bin Ladenites down at all costs, regardless of whatever the Israelis feel or fear about the Ayatollah and his friends. That's their problem, not ours. And so not only have we made it our problem, but we made it our problem to such a degree that we're willing to completely sacrifice America's national interests and even the war on terrorism in order to fight a war for terrorism, as long as it's against Israel's enemies. So you can see where just their interests and ours absolutely diverge. And that's why they have to work so hard to dominate the political conversation in America, to dominate both political parties, to come up with these ridiculous slogans like, Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Well, notice what they didn't say there? Al-Qaeda. They didn't say Iran is the greatest sponsor of al-Qaeda in the world, because that would be a laughable, ridiculous lie. Al-Qaeda and ISIS hate Iran and suicide bomb Iran. What they mean is Iran sponsors Hamas and Hezbollah, who are not a threat to the United States at all and never did anything to America at all. They're just the resistance in Gaza Strip and in southern Lebanon. And, you know, when proto-Hezbollah, not even really Hezbollah, but when proto-Hezbollah did bomb and kill American Marines in Beirut in 1983, the Israelis knew that it was going to happen and refused to warn us because they said that's what they get for sticking their nose into our business in Lebanon. That's what good allies of America, Israel is, not at all. And so that's the reality of it. And that dam is breaking. People are struggling to come up with reasons to believe that Israel is an ally of ours. And then you can see it in some of Trump's picks, including his ambassador, Huckabee, is going to be the ambassador to Israel. That the last excuse that anyone can come up with is that their Sunday school promised them that they would get raptured up to heaven if they support Israel, which is just completely ridiculous, stupid, blasphemous nonsense. And anyone who knows anything about their own religion knows that cynical, lying blasphemers made that up to manipulate you. Grow the hell up. Like the lady who taught you Sunday school knows the first thing about how to force Jesus to come back, and that, yeah, what you got to do is help the Likud murder little babies. And that's what will help Jesus come back, and you'll get to rapture up to heaven in your body. Give me a break. And that's not an attack on Protestant Christianity. That is an attack on absolutely ignorant Sunday school teachers and their cynical, blasphemous, lying ministers who know better than this absolute hogwash that they push on people. Their last excuse for supporting Israel: I was threatened that I won't be able to go to heaven if I don't. How low and filthy and disgusting and cynical could any human man be to try to manipulate other people in that way? It's absolutely sick, and it's all they got left is a bunch of magical claptrap and nothing that was in the Bible until they forged it in the 1860s. I don't know if you, I guess this was an English thing, right? The Darbyites and the you know about the what do they call it? The Bible with the red writing in the side. Is the Schofield Bible. You have a bunch of Zionists in the late 1890s wrote in the margins of the Bible, like, this is, you know, one of Jesus's disciples is a guy named Schofield, and he came and he wrote in the margin, you have to do whatever Israel says. You have to help the Jews retake Jerusalem. You have to fulfill the prophecies in order to force Jesus to do his part and come back and blow up the world and take you up to heaven in your bodies. And they wrote that crap in red in the margins of the Bible, and then people swallow it like it's the inspired word of God, like the rest of it is supposed to be. But at least that's from ancient times where you can't check. Now it's some schmuck named Schofield who doesn't know anything. Why would you listen to him? And who even says that he wrote it anyway? Like, I don't even know who wrote it. Who knows who wrote the red crap in the margins of the King James version of the Bible that says that you have to do whatever this crappy little country that was founded by atheist communists want you to do? Right? The people who founded Israel didn't even believe in God at all. They didn't go there because God promised that land to Abraham. They went there because they thought it'd be easier to steal, and they wanted to get the hell out of Europe. And they didn't want to go to Madagascar.
Wow. Mic drop. Well, you've raised something that it's a point of inquiry related to the point of religion, full stop, when it comes to war. So there's almost a common understanding amongst certain people that war is the driver of war is religious conflict. To what extent, whether it's written in the margins or written in some historical text, or rooted in historic allegiances or ways of living or cultures or beliefs, what extent do you think that argument is true, that war is driven by religious conflict versus...
Well, it often is. I mean, there are certainly religious fanatics on all sides. I bet if you take a general survey of history, you'll find powerful men with landed interests who use religion to manipulate people into doing what they want. But it's always a giant conspiracy of interests. Are there preachers who really believe that you should go fight because we're on the side of God and God is on our side? Absolutely. the rulers of various political governments tend to not be such true believers. But, you know, in this day and age, especially when you have the Americans and their friends destroying and dissolving nation states in the Middle East, you have smaller and smaller militias without real state authority, meaning an ability to truly organize and tax and maintain borders on a permanent basis. And so their recruitment is based much more on belief. This is something that William Lind has talked about. He calls it fifth generation warfare, which is essentially going back to generation one again, where we have pre-state private armies fighting with each other. And again, you need, you know, for the recruitment, for the motivating factor, you need the truly devoted, because otherwise, how do you conscript them? You can't, right? You got to get the guys who don't mind dying for whatever ideological and or religious reasons. So I think, for one example, Osama bin Laden was very pious and believed a lot of his own religious mumbo jumbo, while a lot of the people who followed him did not. But to them, it wasn't about following exactly what the scripture or the scripture said about what you're supposed to do to fight in defense of this and that. They had already made up their mind, and this was the team they wanted to join up with and the people that they wanted to fight alongside of against their common enemies, whether they believed all of bin Laden's shtick or not. It's the same thing with the suicide bombers. This includes the 9/11 hijackers, but also, you know, including people who fought for ISIS and for Al-Qaeda in Syria back 10 years ago. I write all about this in my book, where the people who are the most willing to do the suicide attacks and the people who are the most willing to justify terrorism in the name of Islam are the people who know the least about it. They're the absolute least educated in Islam. They're not necessarily the most fervent in their beliefs, but or in their religious beliefs. They're fervent in their belief of who they want to kill and who they're mad at and who they want to fight and who they've identified as the enemy. And they're very quick to, quote what they think is a verse out of the Quran or whatever to justify, as the good Quran says, you got to suicide bomb the guy. But it's not really what it says. But that's essentially their very surface knowledge of it. But in other words, they're fighting for very earthly and political reasons. But then at the same time, there was, I just saw it back to the bin Ladenite type, like the leaders. I saw a clip. I'm sorry, I forget the guy's name, but he was one of these Saudi preachers who had gone to, well, actually, I don't know if he was just preaching from the Gulf or if he had gone to Syria before back 10 years ago, but he was a notorious radio preacher of the, bin Ladenite variety, maybe even more extreme than him, in terms of demanding civil war against unending war, a sectarian war against the Shiites in the region, which bin Laden was not as sectarian as that. He was more kind of almost even Arab nationalist in a way, by some measures, because he wouldn't really mention the Kurds. They were Arabs. I mean, they were Muslims, but they weren't Arabs, so they would kind of escape notice. But anyway, this preacher, who was like one of the most radical preachers of the era 10 years ago, he was recently spotted on the street in Damascus preaching to these young guys and explaining, this is how the new order in Syria is going to be. I'm almost like, it's funny. It's like a dissociative disorder, like on Breaking Bad or something. Like, part of me just doesn't want to think about what is happening in Syria now, like what the implications are for having that secular state destroyed and replaced with these fifth generation religiously inspired militias and armies. I mean, these guys have committed such war crimes in the past, and the current crop is clearly under American tutelage now, and Western and Turkish control and public relations influence. They know to stop with the suicide bombing and the head chopping. That looks really bad in the West, but still, there have been Ladenites, and in every other sense, and their leaders may not be able to keep a lid on that stuff. This is the army that they have built, and they are pretty extreme. And yes, I think they are very inculcated. I mean, look at it from their point of view. Like, pretend you're a young radicalized Sunni bin Ladenite recruit in Syria right now. On one hand, you have a brutal Iranian-tied secular, i.e. apostate dictator who is, cruelly crushes your insurrection and your friends and your allies and kills them and imprisons them. And then you have a preacher telling you that it's the will of God that we rise up and kill this guy. So, right, you have both of these things happening at the same time. And they both come into play. And quite frankly, like as a not very religious guy, I am probably too biased against taking those factors into account. People who really believe in religion. It can be extremely important. And now I explain very well in the book as best I could. And I think this is true. I don't think it's a contradiction at all to say that it's important to understand that it's not the religion that causes the terrorism. It's the religion in the sense that, like, oh, the scripture says once you believe in Islam hard enough, you got to go find a Christian to suicide bomb in North America somewhere or whatever. That's not what it is. What it is it's the common identity as fellow Muslims between the people who are being persecuted and the people who are avenging them. Just like you had American Muslims who joined the army to avenge the attacks of September 11th. Because it didn't matter that they were of a different religion than most of the people who died in there, although some Muslims were killed that day. But it didn't matter that they were a different religion. They're Americans. So they came from as far as Hawaii and Oregon and wherever to go join the Marines and go kill some Muslims for daring to attack us, right? It's the same thing. It's a sense of shared identity and solidarity between others as even nominal Muslims, as completely uneducated, never even had a chance to be radicalized by religion or never had a chance to be inculcated into a severe and fundamentalist interpretation of religion, but simply identify themselves as being on the same side as other people who are being victimized. And so a great example of this is, of course, would be Bill Clinton bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia for 8 years. And really the two Bushes for 2 years before and after him, right? So for 12 years straight, America was bombing Iraq, leading up to the September 11th attack. And from bases in Saudi Arabia, which is not just their nation, but their holy Arabian Peninsula, land of Mecca and Medina, where Islam was born. 2 of the 3 most important holiest sites in Islam, the third being the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and which America is threatening to help Israel take away from them now. And so this is the kind of thing that absolutely will inspire people to go to war against us. And Islam, unlike, Jesus at one time said, yeah, you should have a sword or something. It's like the most militarist thing Jesus ever said. But Muhammad said, you're obligated to fight when people are killing innocents and you're a grown man and you're responsible for protecting them. Then do your duty and fight them. That's in there. I don't know the exact quotes, but that's in there. And it's not a jihad against kill everyone who's not one of us yet. You will be assimilated or die. That's not what it says. But quite literally, America was attacking them. And just like with my book about Russia, I don't think anybody ever accused me of reciting bin Laden's talking points or taking his side. Just trying to explain. American foreign policy sucks and it results in terrible consequences for people. And anyone ought to be able to just guess that. I mean, I've been joking lately. I don't know if this one will land very well now that I prefaced it that way. But think of it like this. What if Joe Biden had won the election of 1988 and then just like FDR had appointed himself president for life and he'd just been the president this whole time? He ran in the primaries in 88 when I was in junior high school. Yeah, you can see how bald I am and how gray my beard is. When I was in junior high school was when he ran for president the first time. Just imagine he had won then. And it's his same idiotic leadership that we've had this whole time, just causing disaster after disaster after disaster for the American people and for the people of the Middle East and for Eastern Europe as well.
Agreed. At least he would have been an age-appropriate president at that time. But
yeah, seriously.
So I've got 2 questions for you. So firstly, in your view, is there such a thing as a just war?
Sure. Yeah, of course. People, all individual human beings have a right to defend themselves. And if somebody's organized violent force to cross into your territory, you got to defend them. I'm not going to sit here and argue the theoretical justification for a nation state. I'm not much for it. Honestly, I'm a pretty anti-government guy. But does any group of people have the right to defend themselves from an organized attack by any other group of aggressors? Of course they do.
When does self-defense
That's not what we're talking about here.
No.
This is the era of the phony wars. This is the era of enforcing the world empire, which is an entirely different set of questions.
Yes, it is. It is. on that point though, when does self-defense become offense? You know, how do you, because
it could be a tough one.
Because if you take the Israel, you know, narratives around Israel-Palestine, the narrative is that it's in self-defense. And I struggle to understand that if someone attacked me in my home here and if my neighbor attacked me, but then I continued to attack them and their neighbors and their neighbors and their neighbors, it would suddenly not feel like self-defense. It would feel like aggression.
Well, and also it depends on who's the neighbor attacking who in the first place too. And clearly the Israelis are the aggressors here all the way down. I mean, they have built a state on top of another people's land, but they couldn't figure out a smart way to get rid of them. They got rid of some, but they couldn't get rid of the rest. They kidnapped them all, essentially. In 1967, they de facto annexed the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and millions of people. It'd be like you steal, you break in and you squat in your neighbor's house, and you lock him and his family in the basement. And you're just going to keep them in there and claim God gave me that basement, and eventually I'm going to starve you out of there and I'm going to take it too. Like, man, yeah, you wouldn't be surprised if they broke out of there and tried to kill you. It wouldn't be a mystery as to who was aggressing against who and who was attempting to defend themselves. And it's true that Hamas absolutely killed civilians on October the 7th, which is unforgivable. And people who try to conflate civilian settlers with military forces and whatever, I'm not buying it. And in fact, I even have great sympathy for the conscript army of Israel, where I must presume that those guys don't even want to be there, or else why would they have to be drafted? So to me, they're only one hair over the line. They are officially combatants. I'm not stupid, but they are conscripts too. So I have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't really even want to be there at all. So as I would for any other conscript, whether on the Ukrainian or Russian side either, you know what I mean? Or the American side back when we had the draft. But look, when it comes to any given situation, it's going to be almost always extremely difficult to say who's the clear-cut aggressor and who is the clear-cut defender. But there are some examples. I mean, James Baker might have told Saddam Hussein he could invade Kuwait, but James Baker didn't have the authority to do that. He didn't have the authority to tell Saddam Hussein that he could violate the sovereign nation and another sovereign nation's borders. And they were being thieves, and they were being extremely tough in negotiations and calling in their war debts and really squeezing Saddam Hussein. But did he have other options? He must have had other options before invading.
I mean, based on everything you've shared today, I do feel like I've been schooled, which is wonderful. And I encourage healthy debate. So anyone watching or listening who's triggered or upset or has a different point of view, just let us know in the comments. Let's model healthy, non-confrontational dialogue, because that helps us all advance our understanding. That's my call to action to our audience at home. What you've described means if you are able to clearly define, and I don't disagree that there will likely be some instances where it is clearly defined, but I almost feel like in the situation we're in now, using the Ukraine-Russia example, it almost takes a level of oversimplification to break it down to simply like A versus B, when there are so many related forces, as you outlined, that have an input, an impact, an influence, a direct influence on the situation.
This is a great example of a real messy one, where you have the Russians. No one can deny the Russians rolled a bunch of tanks and escalated the war by some thousands of percents in February of 2022. But when they even charge them with war crimes over the kidnapping supposedly of civilians and stuff, which is trumped up. I talk about that in the book. But even when they did that, they didn't just accuse them of the war crime of aggression for launching the war. And that was, I think, probably reflected the fact that it was not exactly clear cut who was aggressing against who and who was defending against who. The Americans and Putin, I think, in a way mocking the Americans, but also, I think, truly invoking the doctrine. So we have a responsibility to protect. That was Barack Obama's excuse for invading Libya in 2011. We can't just let these poor people, so it's not aggression. See, we're saving them. We're doing the right thing by crossing this border. That was Bill Clinton's excuse to break off Kosovo from Serbia in 1999 as well. It's a humanitarian mission. We have to stop these people from being attacked by their own government. On paper, it's the exact same situation. Now, Bill Clinton was violating the law in doing that, but he said he was justified anyway. And so that's the same situation here. And in fact, when Kosovo, it was funny, when Kosovo declared independence in 2008 officially as an independent sovereign state, at the invitation and with the assistance of the West in doing so, the International Court of Justice ruled that actually, yeah, they can do that. That's not illegal after all. If an ethnic part of a sub-state based on an ethnic enclave wants to secede from a larger country, they can after all, which must be news to the Serbs of Bosnia, who they didn't even want a new state. They wanted to stay within Yugoslavia, but they were forced out of it by the Bosnian Muslim plurality that didn't even have a majority, but was in charge of Sarajevo at the time. So the Americans just pick and choose the international law. They want to break South Sudan off of Sudan, no problem. They want to break northern Western Sahara off and give it to Morocco, no problem. They want to recognize Israel's illegal seizure of Syria's Golan Heights, no problem at all. They want to break Kosovo off from Serbia. They want to invade Libya on the pretension that Gaddafi gave his entire army Viagra to rape every woman and girl in the country if we don't stop him. In other words, the most ridiculous hoax that you could never even make up. So stupid. They can launch a war based on that. Then he can launch a war in the name of defending the ethnic Russians who have been quite literally declared outlaws and outside of the protection of their own national central government in Kiev. Right on his border, semi-hot war going on for 7 years at that point. And so doesn't make it justified, but it means that, yeah, it would be pretty hard to say that's a case of clear-cut aggression by the Russian side when they have at least this giant multi-paragraph length explanation of why, well, actually what they're doing is protecting the ethnic Russians there who are being slaughtered, and no one is stopping it. And even though the Americans and their allies and the UN Security Council all signed and rubber stamped the Minsk II deal, it was dead in the water. And as I show in the book, and many other journalists have found this as well, that there are, I don't know, 8 or 10 different quotes of important players in America, France, Germany, and Ukraine saying we never meant to implement Minsk II. It was always a ruse. We were just buying time to arm up the Ukrainian military force because we knew we were going to have to take on the Russians eventually. When, of course, again, self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they armed them up and promised them eventual NATO membership, the more likely they made it that the Russians would go ahead and invade to prevent that. And so those were all factors in it. And very much meaning that it was certainly legally speaking, it was not an absolute clear case of aggression. And then in terms of on the ground in Ukraine, there are many people, of course, everybody's an individual. So there are many people, even in the farthest east provinces and cities, who probably would not have preferred to join with Russia, who maybe would have preferred just independence, or maybe would have preferred to try to work it out with Kiev. But their opinions got canceled, and all the differences of opinion there got canceled when things got escalated to this degree, and they're now being forcibly reincorporated into Russia, whether they want to or not. I think probably most of them are accepting of it if they don't favor it outright. But then how far west can Putin draw that line and keep going before he is outright simply kidnapping people and stealing land in an area where he doesn't have any real claim and where the people absolutely reject his authority, right? Like, that's not exactly clear, and it's going to be negotiated, and some people are going to be stuck on the wrong side of whichever lines, and it's going to be ugly, and it can't be done well because it's not a piece of graph paper. It's a land full of people. And even topography can mean everything, right? Like, you could have literally just highlands and lowlands means that the map is shaped very oddly, where this one enclave is these other people separate from those other people or whatever, where from a bird's eye view, you wouldn't know the difference. These things can be extremely complicated. So, good luck to Trump and the right, the pro-Trump right in America, supporting him to try to find a way to see this thing through. Biden's policy of trying to drag the war out to weaken and hurt and cripple the Russians and hopefully even force a regime change in Moscow is absolutely crazy. Absolute fool's errand. He should have never embarked on this insane policy. And so this is the most important point, really, is that the efforts that Trump will make to bring this war to an end need to be absolutely loudly supported beyond any reason, anything that we can do to support any effort that he can do within reason. Again, not supporting any kind of NATO guarantee for what's left of Ukraine, but anything reasonable he can do to end the war needs to be absolutely loudly and roundly supported. And then any war hawkish moves he makes need to be shouted down. And as long as everybody knows that we're not leftists, we're not parasites, we're not Democrats, and we're not arguing from that point of view. We're arguing from the America First point of view. We want peace. We don't want war with Russia. We don't want war with Iran either. We don't want war with anybody. We're sick and tired of this. A whole generation now, the whole third millennium, not just the century, but the whole third millennium started off on the wrong foot by a bunch of numbnuts. And so enough of that. We should stop that now and try to get a reset, a real reset for America's path forward for the rest of this century, and one where any of these real international conflicts can be settled at the table and without this permanent empire and permanent state of war.
Wow, powerful, Scott. I mean, that in a way would be a very powerful conclusion, but I have one final question for the less than 10 minutes we have left, which is a big question. A lot of the conversation we've had today is about the kind of power structures and the people in power. You know, we've talked about Donald Trump, and I'm someone who is increasingly of the belief that in order for real change to happen, there has to be decentralized, grassroots, people-based solutions. So I'm curious, in your view, what can people do? You know, this is a guiding question that keeps me awake at night. Is it, what can I do as an individual to contribute to peace in the world? You know, do we need a worldwide peace movement to actually shift the dial? So it's not just about American people; it's about people around the world saying no to war, and that we enter into a new phase of existence that is free from war.
Especially when this Ukraine war broke out, we should have had a global general strike. All 8 billion people just say, no, stop this right now. Blinken to Geneva or resign. That was what I was saying at the time. Blinken to Geneva or get the hell out of there and get somebody who's willing to sit down with Lavrov and call a ceasefire and figure this out. It's absolutely intolerable that we continue this way. And yes, it should be all of the whole world. Let the news and TV can't hide it anymore. We've got X now. Let the record reflect that the entire population of Outer Mongolia agrees with everyone else too. We want an end to this war now. The idea that they have the right to escalate the risk of nuclear war by even 1% over such trivial issues and self-created crises as the conflict over the Donbass is just absolutely unforgivable. It's treason against mankind, with the enemy being the H-bombs. Anyone, carelessly and fruitlessly increasing the risk of nuclear war, for no discernible, arguable reason beyond a bunch of fairy tales and comic book stories about beating up bullies on the playground and a bunch of crap. They should be in prison. They should all be removed from office and in prison. How dare they? And how could anyone in the world think that there's any priority that matters greater than America's relationship with Russia? There's just nothing else in the world that compares to Washington and Moscow getting along forever, or until our 12,000 H-bombs or 14,000 H-bombs we still have left are gone, whichever comes first.
Wow. Scott, you've been an amazing guest. You've given us an amazing, for other people who are in the similar position to myself with the concerned state of the world and what we're witnessing, perhaps without the understanding that Scott has brought with his footnotes and his amazing books today. Scott has given us a very powerful overview of the state of reality at the moment, but also hinted at some of the solutions. And I for one, and going into 2025 now, will be asking myself deep questions about what role I can play. As founder of Free Humanity, we've got an organization. We want to build a movement around building a global peace, a people-led peace movement. This is part of our focus. If you're interested in hearing more about that, go to freehumanity.org. Scott, this has been so powerful. I want to make sure that people understand more about where to get your books. We've talked about Provoked, which specifically looks at the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. You've got another book coming out. Is that right, in the near future?
No, I'm never writing another book again. I swear. My My previous books are Fool's Errand about Afghanistan and Enough Already about the war on terrorism. Provoked is the latest about the Cold War with Russia. You can find all those at scotthorton.org. And yes, everyone keeps asking, the audiobook is coming soon. Sign up for the podcast feed there. It's my Substack is scotthortonshow.com, and I'll have the audiobook podcast series coming out there for people starting here shortly.
Incredible. You'll also find Scott's podcast there, where it's just a real in-depth treasure trove of a resource bank of all things conflict and anti-war and how we can move forward. So thank you so much, Scott. It's been a wonderful conversation with you today around quite distressing subject matter, quite frankly, but in many ways, I think there is hope at this point in history. We're in a transformational time. So thanks again. And for those at home, please do share this episode. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And we cannot wait to see where we go next.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. Appreciate it very much.
Wow. As I said at the top of the episode, I came into this conversation wanting to learn more about the state of war in the world and what we can do to change it. And my gosh, I was schooled. And as I've alluded to throughout this, I come into this with an open mind. I come into this with an open heart. I want to learn. And I know there are things that Scott would have said that would have upset some people, provoked others. And, I lacked the background to be able to challenge or to probe. But this, for me, is a starting point of a deeper conversation. So if there are other people you would like me to interview around this subject that provide a different point of view, I'm all ears. I'm at a point of just wanting to understand, to soak up knowledge. And I hope you are too, so that we can actually explore this. Because what's evident is that amongst the war, we have a fog of war where there is a war on truth. The mainstream media narratives, as we saw during COVID, are deeply co-opted and corrupted, and the same is inevitably true around war, as we heard today. So it's a conversation that, sadly, even though we're trying to bring a more solution-focused, empowering discussions to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast as we seek to understand how we can live free and prosper, unfortunately, a lot of the issues we're grappling with are troubling. But what's important is that we hold that view of hope for the future, of optimism. I truly believe that at some point in our future, we can exist in a world without violent conflict and war. But the questions we ask today can determine the actions that we take tomorrow. And I believe that's what's most important now as we seek to understand the environment that we're in. So let me know what you think of the conversation. Do let me know your thoughts and reflections on the discussion, points of contention, points of agreement. I'm very curious to read those. And if you would like to play a closer part in what we're doing here at the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast, we have the Live Free and Prosper community where you'll get early access to all of our episodes. You can join live podcast interviews. You get behind the scenes conversations and content, discount on merch and events and more. Plus an amazing community of people who are equally trying to make sense of the world and have a bold aspirational view for what the future could look like so that we can move towards a world that is free, peaceful and prosperous. If you'd like to be part of that, then please head over to danastingregory.com/supporter. We've got a very small team who work very, very hard to put this together. And we need all the support we can get as an independent media outlet. So please do come and join us at danastingregory.com/supporter. Please do subscribe on all your favorite platforms, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple, all the major audio platforms is where you'll find us. So please do subscribe and leave a comment. And I want to thank you very much for tuning in. And please do share this conversation as I said. So we'll see you again very soon. Until next time, live free and prosper.